The name was wrong. Greth Valayan did not know why it was wrong yet, only that somewhere in the stack of neural pathways carved by 3 years of the Draven conflict, a recognition node had fired on the word Ashland and produced a sound like a hull breach alarm. He stood at the signing table on Vithara Point Station, the ceasefire document glowing in cold blue on the display surface before him, and he read the human signatory line again. Lieutenant Commander Vera Ashland, Terran Expeditionary Force, Logistics and Resource Liaison, Northern Sector. He had been reading that line for 8 seconds and had not moved. Solveth Narak, the Kaldrathi observer seated to his left, noticed. The smaller being's secondary eyelids had dropped halfway in the expression his species used for quiet concern, and he had not said anything, which was the correct institutional response to a Phraxian Commodore standing at a signing table not moving. On the other side of the table, the human woman in the gray liaison jacket sat with her forearms resting flat and her eyes on the table surface, waiting with the specific quality of stillness that Greth had come to associate with humans who had learned to be patient inside small enclosed spaces for long stretches of time. He had not associated it with her specifically until this moment, because he had not known what she was. For 3 days she had briefed supply line logistics and civilian transit corridors and fuel depot decommissioning schedules with the unadorned competence of a mid-rank bureaucrat doing a job she neither loved nor resented. Plain gray jacket. No insignia beyond the single silver stripe of her stated rank. She had referred to herself as the logistics liaison so consistently that the room's other participants had begun doing the same, which Greth now realized was a thing she had arranged. The room had 4 other humans in it. None of them had corrected the framing. That, too, was a thing she had arranged. He read the name again. Ashland. The conference room on Vithara Point had been designed, as neutral party facilities generally were, to be as inoffensive as possible to the greatest number of species. The seating was adjustable. The lighting defaulted to a spectrum that read as adequate, without being actively unpleasant to anyone present. The table was a pale composite material that did not reflect strongly and did not carry the territorial associations that natural materials sometimes did. The ventilation was tuned to a blend that no one would find comfortable, but no one would find unbearable, which was the closest thing to a diplomatic principle the station's facilities committee had managed to encode into the physical infrastructure. Greth had spent 12 hours in this room across 3 days, and had noted, with the specific detachment of a Phraxian officer who spent significant portions of his professional life in rooms he did not choose, that the woman in the gray jacket appeared to be the only person in it who seemed genuinely unbothered by the ventilation. He had attributed this, when he had attributed it at all, to human physiological adaptability. Humans were known to have a broad tolerance for suboptimal atmospheric conditions, a trait that the galactic biological record connected to their species' origin on a planet whose weather systems had, by documented account, been chaotic and frequently hostile. He had not attributed it to anything more specific than that. He was, retroactively, revising a number of his attributions. On the first day of the session, she had arrived 4 minutes early and arranged her data tablet and a physical notepad on the table in front of her, with the practiced automaticity of someone who had done it in many rooms before this one. She had introduced herself to the room as the Northern Sector Logistics Liaison, without elaborating on what the Northern Sector was or what its logistics had involved. The room had accepted this without comment, because there was no reason not to. On the second day, she had produced, without preamble, a restructured draft of the Civilian Transit Framework Annex that was roughly 40% more workable than the version the Council's preliminary team had assembled. and she had walked the room through the changes in the flat, declarative register of someone who was not asking for approval, but was providing information, and the room had accepted that without comment either, because the draft was better, and the room could see that it was better, and there was no institutional advantage to pretending otherwise. On the third day, today, she had been 20 minutes into a presentation on fuel depot decommissioning timelines when Greth had picked up the final document for the preliminary review that preceded signing and read her name and stopped. He placed the data pad face down on the table with a care that his hands did not entirely agree with. The Kaldrathi observer's secondary eyelids dropped the rest of the way. The two Vraxian aides standing at the room's far wall, Commodore Dreth and the young signals officer, Tavek, had not moved and would not until he signaled, because they were professionals, and their job in this room was to be still until stillness was insufficient. Greth was a professional for the same reason. He pressed both palms flat against the cool surface of the table, which was something Vraxians did when they needed to think and did not want the room to know it. And he thought. The Keller's Rock engagement had been assigned the designation Anomaly 7 in his theater's field record system. He had not named it that. His tactical intelligence officer had named it that after the 4th week of the siege, when the preliminary assumption that the human garrison was receiving resupply via an undetected route had been disproven 3 times over, and some other explanation was required. Anomaly 7. The name itself told a story, if you knew how to read Vraxian institutional vocabulary. Anomaly designations were reserved for events that could not be categorized under any existing tactical framework, and that the relevant commander did not, at the time of filing, want to explain to higher command with any more specificity than was necessary. It was a placeholder, a way of saying something happened here that we do not fully understand and are not ready to characterize. Greth had used it himself on 3 occasions across his career. The previous 2 times, the anomaly had eventually resolved into a comprehensible explanation, and the designation had been closed and replaced with the appropriate tactical category. Anomaly 7 had never been closed. It had sat open in the theater's operational record for 2 years, and whenever Greth had looked at it, which he had done perhaps a dozen times, the looking had produced that cold compression under his sternum that meant he was encountering something his existing frameworks were inadequate to address. He had attributed this to incomplete intelligence. He was revising that attribution now. The garrison at Keller's Rock had been listed in Vraxian field reports as 23 human soldiers at engagement initiation. The civilian population of the colony was listed as 411. The engagement had lasted 94 days. The relevant outcome statistics sat in a part of Greth Valan's memory that did not arrange things by date or location, but by the feeling they had produced. That specific cold compression, arriving again, like a familiar weather pattern settling over familiar terrain. He had not known until this moment who commanded that garrison. The name had never appeared in any Vraxian field document. It had not appeared in the formal engagement report filed by the Terran Expeditionary Force through the Galactic Council's conflict registry, either, which he had reviewed 6 standard months ago when the ceasefire negotiations had begun, because he was the kind of officer who reviewed everything. He had assumed the omission was an administrative artifact. He understood now that it was not. He picked up the data pad. He turned it over. He looked at the name. The woman across the table had not looked up. "Lieutenant Commander Ashland," he said. She looked up then, and the thing Greth noticed first was that she did not look startled, which meant she had been waiting for this moment since the session began, and possibly for longer. Commodore Valan, she said. There was a pause that Solveth Narak would later describe in the Observer's formal report as lasting approximately 4 seconds but feeling considerably longer to all present. The 2 Vraxian aides at the wall did not move. The 4 other humans at the table remained still in the particular way that suggested they had been briefed to remain still, which was another thing she had arranged. There is a Keller's Rock in the northern sector, Greth said. There is, she said. You are aware, he said, that the Keller's Rock engagement is listed in Vraxian theater records as Anomaly 7. She looked at him steadily. Her eyes were the blue-hazel color that appeared frequently in human faces, and that Vraxian visual processing rendered as a shifting gray, which made it difficult to gauge what the expression behind them was doing. She said, I wasn't aware of the Vraxian designation, no. Greth set the datapad down again. He did it more slowly this time, because his hands had developed a faint tremor, and he was managing it. He said, You commanded the garrison. She did not answer immediately. She considered the question for a moment that was almost imperceptible, and then she said, Yes. The words sat in the room's recycled air and did not dissipate. Solveth Narak's eyelids lifted fully for the first time since the session had started, which was the Kaldrathi equivalent of sitting bolt upright. The signals officer Tavik, behind Greth's left shoulder, produced a sound through his vocal apparatus that was not quite a word and was not quite not a word. Greth did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the woman across the table and he said, With respect, Lieutenant Commander, I would like to understand something before we conclude today's session. All right, she said. The engagement record at Keller's Rock, he said, shows 23 Terran soldiers at initiation, 411 civilians. The engagement lasted 94 days. He paused. Your side sustained 11 combat fatalities over that period. 12, she said. Corporal Reyes died in a medical bay on Tehran Station 9 days after we were relieved. The Council's registry counted 11 because she survived evacuation. Greth absorbed that correction with the specific internal quality of a person discovering a container is heavier than they anticipated. He said, 12. 12, she confirmed quietly. He looked down at the table surface for a moment, not because he needed to gather his thoughts, but because he needed the room not to be watching his face while he managed the thing happening behind it. 847. That was the Vraxian casualty figure attributed to the Keller's Rock Theater over the 94-day engagement. He did not say the number aloud. He did not need to. She had almost certainly been told the number at some point in the 6 months of preliminary negotiations, or she had deduced it from the engagement reports that had passed through official channels, or both, because she was the kind of officer who did not walk into a room without knowing what was in it. He looked up and said, The civilian population. 0 losses, she said. 411 out. We got a couple of plasma burns during the evacuation window on day 88, but both were minor and both survived. No civilian fatalities. Greth Falan sat with that for a moment. 0 civilian losses in a 94-day siege, 12 military fatalities, 847 on the other side of the ledger. The numbers did not arrange themselves into a coherent framework. They sat in a stack and refused to make sense of each other. He said, How? It was not quite a question, and not quite a statement, and she seemed to understand that because she did not answer it immediately, as though it were simple. She looked at the table for a moment, then back at him, and there was something in her face that he could not read and suspected was not meant to be read. She was arranging something again, he thought, deciding how much was necessary. The colony had a water processing plant with 3 subterranean levels, she said. We used the lower two as a civilian shelter. The Draven forces never located it, which tells me their intelligence on subsurface infrastructure was inadequate for that type of colony, or they decided it wasn't worth the resource expenditure to find. She paused. We kept the families in the lower level for most of the siege, rotating the adults who could work through the upper level in shifts to manage supplies and run communications. Most, he said. Evacuation began on day 67. Small groups, night movements, irregular intervals so the pattern couldn't be modeled and anticipated. We got the last group out on day 88. She said it the way someone says a thing they have said many times before. Not to an audience, but to themselves, in the hours when precise recitation is the only thing that holds the sequence still. The 12 who died were all soldiers. They died doing their jobs. There was a pause in the room of the variety that no one fills, because there is nothing useful to put in it. Solveth Narek said, carefully, "Lieutenant Commander, with the Observer's indulgence, for the record, your rank at the time of the Keller's Rock engagement." She said, "First Lieutenant." The Observer's mandibles shifted in the expression Greth associated with recalculation. "You commanded the garrison as a first lieutenant." "The captain was in the second casualty group," she said. "Day 9. Solveth Narak looked at Greth. Greth did not look back, because he was watching the human woman's face, which had done something almost imperceptible when she said, "Day 9, a compression around the orbital muscles, gone in less than a second, that his visual processing logged as a notation and his institutional training filed under involuntary disclosure." She had not meant to show that. She had shown it anyway. He noted it and moved past it, because pursuing it would have been a different kind of cruelty than the one he was already perpetrating by asking these questions. And he was trying, in this room, to be a negotiator and not a general. He said, "You've been attending these sessions for 3 days." "Yes," she said, "presenting as a logistics liaison." "I am a logistics liaison," she said. "Among other things." He said, "Your jacket." She looked down at the gray jacket for a moment, then back at him. She did not say anything. He said, "You removed your insignia." She said, "I removed some of it." He said, "Why?" She considered this. Not in the way of someone deciding whether to answer honestly, but in the way of someone deciding how much context was necessary to make the honest answer useful. She said, "These are ceasefire negotiations. Both delegations came to the table because they want an agreement that holds. An agreement holds when the parties on both sides feel they got something close enough to fair that they can defend it to their own institutions. If I walk in here in full commendation kit, you don't see a logistics liaison. You see Keller's Rock. Everything I say about fuel depot decommissioning schedules gets filtered through Keller's Rock. Everything Solveth Narak hears gets filtered through Keller's Rock. The other human officers in this room become adjacencies to Keller's Rock instead of independent voices. The work gets harder." She paused. "The jacket was the expedient choice." He said, "You anticipated that I would be in this room." She said, "I knew the senior Vraxian theater commander would be the delegation lead." "Yes." He said, "And you knew I would recognize the name." She said, "I thought it was possible you'd reviewed the engagement records. Officers who want an agreement that holds tend to review engagement records." A pause. "I was hoping you'd see the name at signing after the substantive work was done. That was the preferred sequence." Greth Valan looked at the woman across the table from him, at the gray liaison jacket over whatever was underneath it, at the single silver stripe of a rank That was not the rank she held, at the flat forearms and the steady eyes, and he was aware of a specific sensation that he had not expected to feel in a room that smelled of recycled air and institutional paperwork and the careful optimism of two species trying to stop killing each other. The sensation was something close to respect, except that respect was a category he applied to military peers and institutional counterparts, and it did not fully cover what he was looking at, because what he was looking at was something that had chosen to be smaller than it was in the service of a larger objective, and had done it not with sacrifice or reluctance, but with the quiet precision of someone who had identified the correct instrument for the task and used it. The gray jacket was the correct instrument. He understood that now. He said, "What does your full commendation configuration look like?" There was a beat of silence, during which Solveth Narek's secondary eyelids descended to the halfway position again. The signals officer, Tavek, behind Greth's shoulder, had stopped making sounds of any kind. One of the other human officers at the table, a senior lieutenant whose name was Perez or Peters, Greth was not certain, had stopped writing in his note tablet and was looking at the table surface with the careful expression of a person who has decided their role in the next 60 seconds is to be invisible. She said, "I have 4 commendations, 3 campaign medals, and a Valor Cross." She said it the way she said everything, flat, declarative, no elevation in the delivery, as if she were reading from a maintenance manifest. "The Valor Cross is the one with the most visible hardware. I left it in my quarters." Greth said, 3 years of the Draven conflict. 2 years before Keller's Rock, and then the next cycle and a half after, she said. And the cross is for Keller's Rock. "The cross is for the Day 88 evacuation," she said, specifically. "The siege itself gets the campaign medal like everyone else who was there." He sat with that too. The "like everyone else" had landed in the room with a very particular weight, because there had been 12 soldiers at Keller's Rock who were not there to receive anything. He suspected she knew that was what he was hearing and had said it the way she said it deliberately, as a corrective against anything that sounded like she was claiming something those 12 had equally earned. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand it is not asked as a provocation." She said, "All right." He said, "Why did you agree to come to these negotiations?" She looked at him steadily. The gray-blue eyes did not shift. She said, "Because the people who send soldiers to 94-day sieges generally want the war to end before the next one. I wanted to be in the room where that happened." He said, "You could have sent the transit framework analysis through channels. You didn't need to be the one in the room." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "The analysis is easier to defend when the person who built it is available to explain the load-bearing assumptions. Supply chain logic has a tendency to look arbitrary from the outside until you've stood in a corridor at 3 in the morning, trying to figure out how many cubic meters of ration packs you can fit through a compromised transit junction." She paused. "I've done that. I know where the non-obvious decisions live. That knowledge is useful in a negotiating room." He said, "And that's all." She looked at him. She said, "No, that's not all." She was quiet for another moment, in the way of someone determining how much of the remainder was relevant and how much was private. She said, "I had 12 people who did not survive Keller's Rock. The 411 who did survive are living in resettlement housing on Vithara Station right now, while this process works out whether they can go back to the colony. I would like the process to work out well. I would like the transit frameworks and the resource-sharing annexes and the fuel depot decommissioning schedules to be as functional as possible, because functional infrastructure is what makes the difference between people going home and people waiting indefinitely in resettlement housing. She said it without elevation, without the particular tonal signal that would have turned it into a speech. It was just the accounting of what was true. That's why I'm in the room. Greth Valan sat with that for a moment. He thought about the 12 names on the casualty list, and the 411 people in resettlement housing, and the way she had just placed those two things next to each other without asking him to draw the line between them, because she apparently trusted him to draw it himself. He thought about the fact that she had been in this room for 3 days building the framework that would let those 411 people go home without telling the room who she was or what she had done to get them out in the first place. And he thought that he did not have a word for that in Vraxian, and the absence of the word was itself a kind of information. He said, "You've been in the room. You've been helpful. The transit corridor proposals you put forward on day 2 were substantively better than what our team had drafted." Something crossed her face that he interpreted, cautiously, as the thing humans called dry amusement, though his visual processing was not fully confident in that classification. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You understand that my recognition of your name changes nothing about the validity of the work already done in these sessions." She said, "I was hoping it wouldn't." He said, "I'm stating it for the record." She said, "I appreciate that." Solveth Narak cleared his throat, which was the Kaldrathi signal for the observer wishes to note something formally. Both of them looked at him. He arranged his writing tablet with the brief, precise movements of a Kaldrathi, marshaling his thoughts, and then he said, "For the formal record, I think it is worth noting that over the course of the last 3 days, Lieutenant Commander Ashland's contributions to the Resource Sharing Annex and the Civilian Transit Framework have been, and I will use a precise word here, significant. The framework as it currently stands reflects a more granular understanding of how human logistics operations actually function in contested zones than any document this observer has seen produced in 6 months of preliminary negotiation at the council level. I note this because if there are parties in this room or outside inclined to retrospectively reframe those contributions in light of what has been disclosed, they should do so with the awareness that the observer's notes are going to be very clear about who produced the work and when and under what conditions, and the Council's conflict registry will contain that notation whether the parties find it convenient or otherwise." He closed his tablet. The room was quiet for a moment. She said, "Thank you, Narak," he said with the careful dignity of a Kaldrathi who had just said something that was not institutionally required of him, and knew it. "You are welcome, Lieutenant Commander." Greth Valan looked at the ceasefire document. He looked at her name in the signatory block, the plain silver stripe of a logistics liaison rank, the brackets around logistics and resource liaison, northern sector. He thought about the gray jacket and what was under it. He thought about 88 days underground with 411 civilians and a shrinking garrison and irregular evacuation intervals that could not be modeled. He thought about evacuation patterns designed by someone who understood that a pattern with no pattern was itself a pattern, and that the only solution to an opponent who modeled behavior was behavior that declined to be modeled. He thought about an officer who had walked into a ceasefire conference and taken the jacket off the shelf and put it on deliberately because she wanted the negotiations to succeed more than she wanted the room to know who she was, and who had then spent 3 days producing framework language that protected civilians on both sides of the conflict, and who had sat in this room for those 3 days knowing that her name on the final document would eventually produce this conversation, and had decided the work was worth the conversation. He could not decide if that was the most disciplined thing he had ever encountered, or something else entirely. And that uncertainty sat in him in a particular way that he was not certain had a Vraxian name. Vraxian. He said, "Lieutenant Commander." She said, "Commodore." He said, "I would like to adjourn today's session and resume tomorrow at the same time, if that is acceptable." She said, "That's fine." He said, "The signatory block on the final document. I would like to propose, if the Terran delegation has no objection, that your full rank and commendation notation be included in the formal record, not as a gesture, as accurate documentation." She looked at him. He was not certain what she was looking at him for. Whatever it was, she seemed to find it, or find the absence of it. And either outcome appeared to satisfy some internal calibration, because her expression settled into something that was not quite neutral, and not quite anything else he had a word for. She said, "That's a decision for the delegation lead." He said, "I'm asking for your personal position." There was a pause. She said, "The work was the work. It doesn't need a medal attached to it to count." He said, "No, but the record does." She looked at the table. She was quiet for a moment that was longer than the previous ones, and in it Greth had the sense that she was doing the calculation she always did, measuring the cost of a thing against what the thing cost not to do, and arriving at the same place she always arrived, which was the place where the answer was clear, and the answer was difficult, and she was going to do the difficult thing, because the clear thing and the difficult thing were the same thing, and she did not appear to know how to do otherwise. She said, "I'll ask the delegation lead." He nodded. Once, the Vraxian gesture that closed a formal exchange without requiring the other party to produce a reciprocal response. He gathered his data pads. He stood. The two aides at the wall came to attention. Solveth Narak closed his observer's tablet with a soft click. The four other humans at the table began the murmured, unhurried movement of a delegation adjourning a session, the rustle of equipment, and the low exchange of procedural notes. And in the middle of all of it, the woman in the gray jacket sat for a moment without moving, as if she was finishing something internally before she returned to the room. Greth watched her from the periphery of his visual field, not because he was still processing the Keller's rock numbers, though he was, but because he was trying to settle a question that had been sitting at the back of his awareness since the session had resumed and he had said her name aloud and watched her not flinch. The question was whether he was disturbed by what he had learned or reassured by it. And after a period of standing in the middle of the question, he had decided the answer was yes to both, and that the yes to both was the correct answer, and that anything more comfortable than yes to both would have been wrong, and that the fact that he was standing in the room where a ceasefire for the Draven conflict was being assembled was in some non-trivial way connected to the fact that this woman had spent 94 days in a subterranean water plant keeping 411 people alive, and had then come here and taken the jacket out of the shelf and put it on. And both of those things were part of the same thing. He was almost at the door when her voice reached him from behind. "Commodore Vallon." He turned. She had not stood. She was still seated at the table, both forearms flat, looking at him across the room with the same quality of stillness she had maintained for 3 days. She said, "The transit framework in the Northern Annex, the provision that allows civilian resupply convoys to pass through former engagement zones without secondary inspection unless the cargo manifest triggers a flag." She paused. "Make sure your delegation doesn't trade that provision away in the morning session." It's in the resource-sharing annex as a soft clause, and our team knows it. Someone may attempt to trade it for the fuel depot timeline. Don't let them. That provision protects your civilian populations as much as ours. Whoever briefs against it on your side is thinking about enforcement overhead, not the people the enforcement is supposed to protect. He looked at her across the room for a moment. He said, "Noted." She said, "Good negotiation, Commodore." He said, "Good negotiation, Lieutenant Commander." He went through the door. In the corridor, Tavek fell into step beside him and maintained a scrupulous silence for 11 paces before he said very carefully, "Commodore, Keller's Rock." Greth Valan said, "I know." Tavek said, "She's been in this room for 3 days." Greth said, "I know." Tavek said, "She knew you didn't know." Greth said, "Yes." Tavek said nothing for another 4 paces and then said, "Should I be—" and stopped because there was apparently no completion for that sentence that did not become a different and worse sentence. He understood the problem. Greth had the same problem. The category that applied here did not have an established institutional response, which was part of the point, and probably part of the calculation she had made when she took the jacket off the shelf 3 days ago. Greth said, "Brief the delegation lead tonight. Tell them the transit framework provision in the Northern Annex is not a trading chip under any circumstances. If anyone on our team disagrees, send them to me." Tavek said, "Yes, sir." They walked the rest of the corridor without speaking. The station's recycled air smelled of coolant and pressurized metal, and the faint organic trace of 100 species passing through a neutral space on their way to and from the edges of things. At the far end of the corridor, through the transparent panel, Vithara Point's docking arm extended over the dark between stars, a thin bridge of metal and light between here and everything else. Greth stopped at the panel for a moment and looked at it before he continued toward the delegation's assigned quarters, and he thought about gray jackets and subterranean water plants and evacuation intervals too irregular to model, and he thought about the fact that he had sat across a table from the officer who had produced Anomaly 7 for 3 days without knowing it and without her correcting his ignorance. And he thought about the fact that the transit framework annex she had spent those 3 days building was going to keep living people alive in the former conflict zones for the next several years. And all of those things were the same thing seen from different angles. And he was not certain what the right name for that thing was, but he was fairly certain it was not logistics. 6 standard weeks later, in the formal signing session for the Draven ceasefire, the signatory block on the Terran delegation's line read, Lieutenant Commander Vera Ashland, TEF, Valor Cross Recipient, Keller's Rock Garrison Commander, Northern Sector Logistics Liaison. The Terran delegation lead had apparently had no objection. The document was transmitted to the Galactic Council's conflict registry at 1400 station time and entered the permanent record. Greth Valan signed his own line at 1402 and did not look at hers while he did it, because he was a professional, and because looking would not have changed anything, and because he had already read it 4 times in the 3 minutes before the session opened, and that was sufficient. In the corridor, after the signing, someone from the Terran delegation, a young lieutenant with the particular expression of a person doing something they had been quietly working up the nerve to do, walked past him and stopped and said, in translated standard, Commodore Valan, for what it's worth, my unit was at Ferath Station during the Draven offensive. The supply lines Ashland ran out of the northern sector kept us in plasma cells for 6 months when the direct route was contested. We noticed. And then the lieutenant moved on with the bearing of a person who had said what they needed to say and did not require anything further from the recipient. Greth Valayan stood in the corridor for a moment after the lieutenant had gone and thought about supply lines. The logistics liaison who had rebuilt the northern sector's resupply network during 2 years of active conflict, who had then held a colony for 94 days with 23 soldiers and 0 civilian losses, who had then come to a ceasefire conference in a gray jacket and spent 3 days getting the transit framework provisions right, so that future supply convoys could move through former engagement zones without the secondary inspection overhead. That would have made the whole system too slow to be useful. He thought about that specific combination of competencies and about what they indicated, about how she understood the relationship between the tactical and the structural and the human, and about the question of whether a mind that held all of that simultaneously and deployed each piece at the right moment, in the right sequence, was something the galaxy was safer for having in it, or whether the galaxy was simply whatever it was, and she was one of the things it contained that the rest of it was going to have to figure out how to account for. He filed a report with the Vraxian Theater Command that afternoon. The relevant section read, "The human officer who served as logistics liaison for the Terran delegation is not, in this observer's assessment, primarily a logistics officer or primarily a garrison commander, or primarily the holder of the engagement record currently designated Anomaly 7 in the Northern Sector Field Archive. She is primarily a person who identifies the most useful instrument available for a given situation and uses it without requiring recognition for the using. Recommend that any Vraxian institutional assumptions about the scope of human specialization be reviewed at the command level before the next joint session." The basis for this recommendation is set out in the attached Keller's Rock Engagement Summary, which is filed separately under its existing designation. He submitted it. He closed the report. He went to find Tavek and begin the work of getting them home. The gray jacket, as far as Greth Valan knew, went back to the shelf in her quarters where it apparently lived between occasions that required it. What went under it, in the drawer, or the locker, or wherever 4 commendations and a Valor Cross were stored when their owner decided they were more useful out of sight than in it, he did not know. He thought, in the station corridor with the docking arm framed in the transparent panel behind him and the ceasefire filed in the permanent record ahead of him. That not knowing was probably the correct state of affairs. That the gray jacket was going back to the shelf meant it was coming back off it at some point. For some occasion, she had already identified, and he had not. For some room she had already decided to enter, and some work she had already decided needed doing. That was either a comforting thought or a destabilizing one, and after standing with it for a moment in the recycled air of Vithara Point Station, Greth Valan decided it was both, and that both was, as before, the correct answer.